a stolen brooch, a vanished secret, and Miss Marple watching quietly. Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I am your host, Alexander. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from today. I can't wait to hear from you now. Let's begin. On a mild summer afternoon, the vicarage garden at St. Mary Mead was a scene of genteel festivity. The lawns had been scythed until they resembled a green velvet carpet. The flower beds were crowded with bright marigolds and neat rows of larkspur, and a long trestle table sagged slightly under the weight of sponge cakes, trifles, and the sort of sandwiches that village ladies prided themselves on, thin as paper and filled with cucumber, egg, and watercress. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had organized the gathering, bustled about with an air of proprietorship, her sharp little eyes missing nothing. To the casual observer, it was an afternoon of perfect tranquility. Yet, as often happens in English villages, tranquility was only a veneer. Beneath the small talk about dahlias and the occasional complaint about the weather, there ran the quiet currents of envy, suspicion, and curiosity. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a wicker chair beneath the trellis where pale pink roses climbed, was well aware of it. She did not intrude into the conversation around her, but observed it with that mild, bird-like attentiveness that always seemed harmless until it was too late. It was during this quiet occupation that Miss Marple noticed Margaret Elwood. Margaret was a pretty girl, not yet 20, with an innocence about her that made her a favorite among the older women of the parish. She was the daughter of the Elwoods, who ran the small draper's shop by the green. No one would have called them poor, but they were certainly not people of means. Margaret, like many girls in the village, usually dressed with modest, simple frocks, neat shoes, and the sort of accessories one might find at a church bazaar. But today, something was very different. Pinned to the bodice of Margaret's light muslin dress was a brooch unlike any Miss Marple, or indeed anyone else present, had ever seen upon her. It was fashioned in the shape of a lily, its petals enameled in a deep, shimmering blue that caught the sun with a flash almost like fire. At its center was a small stone, either sapphire or an unusually fine piece of glass, difficult to tell at a distance. But whatever its composition, the effect was dazzling. The brooch seemed startlingly out of place on Margaret, like a coronet upon a milkmaid. Miss Marple, after a moment of unobtrusive study, leaned forward and spoke gently. "My dear, what a most unusual brooch you are wearing. One hardly sees such workmanship outside of Bond Street." Margaret's cheeks flushed a delicate rose. Her hand flew to the clasp as though to shield it. "Oh, this." "It was a gift," she stammered, and quickly looked away, her eyes darting across the lawn as though hoping the subject might vanish, into the petunias. Miss Marple said nothing further, but she tucked the observation away in her mental ledger. One learned much by watching how people received compliments. Others had noticed too. A ripple of whispering began almost immediately among the matrons gathered near the refreshment table. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose sense of propriety was as sharp as her chin, tightened her lips. "Quite unsuitable," she muttered audibly enough for Mrs. Bantry to hear. "Far too fine for a girl in Margaret's position. It gives altogether the wrong impression." Mrs. Bantry, who was less censorious but more curious, lowered her voice and said, "Do you suppose it was given by someone, well, unsuitable? A gentleman admirer, perhaps?" Behind them another voice chimed in with relish. "I've seen that very piece before. Not here, of course. But I'm almost sure it was mentioned in connection with some dreadful burglary in London a few years ago. They called it the Blue Lily or something of that sort." The hum of speculation grew. By the time the teacups were replenished, half the garden had heard of the mysterious brooch, and each whispered theory made it glitter all the more strangely. Margaret herself seemed ill at ease, smiling too brightly, excusing herself too often, and finally slipping into the shadow of the limes to avoid further comment. Miss Marple sipped her tea in silence, her mind sorting the matter as she might sort knitting stitches. She recalled, for instance, a maid in the village long ago who had suddenly begun wearing a fur stole quite beyond her means. It had transpired that she had been engaged in a most unfortunate entanglement with the son of her employer. Objects, Miss Marple reflected, told stories if only one watched closely enough. By the time dusk began to fall and the first bats flitted against the pale sky, the party had broken up. Guests departed in twos and threes, their chatter following them down the lanes like trailing ivy. Margaret was among the last to leave. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted that she clutched her shawl tightly about her, her head bent, as though she feared not only the cool of evening, but also the eyes of the villagers upon her. The village sank into its usual evening quiet. Lamps glowed behind lace curtains, and a bicycle bell tinkled faintly in the distance, but tranquility did not last. It was only an hour later, when most households were preparing for bed, that a scream shattered the peace. It came from the lane near the Elwoods' cottage, a thin, piercing cry that carried unnaturally in the still air. Windows were thrown open, doors banged, and voices called out. Miss Marple, who had just settled her knitting, rose at once, wrapped a shawl about her shoulders, and stepped briskly into the night. Though she was frail in appearance, her mind and her step were steady when duty called. By the time she reached the lane, a small crowd had already gathered villagers, clutching lanterns, their faces pale with alarm. At the center of the group, by the shadow of the hedgerow, lay Margaret Elwood. Her shawl was twisted awkwardly about her shoulders, her hair disheveled, and her eyes stared upward in a wide, unseeing terror. A faint bruise marked her neck, though whether from a fall or a hand was unclear. But one thing was certain: the blue lily brooch was gone. There was a collective intake of breath, followed by the low murmur of shocked voices. Mrs. Price Ridley exclaimed, "I knew it! Nothing good ever comes of flaunting such finery." Another muttered about thieves. A young man cried out that the constable must be sent immediately. Miss Marple alone remained quiet, her keen eyes moving slowly over the scene. She bent, not touching, but studying the angle of Margaret's shawl, the faint trail in the gravel nearby, and the peculiar absence of any handbag or personal item. It was not only a theft. Something darker had come to St. Mary Mead. She straightened, her expression composed, her voice gentle but firm. "I fear," she said, "that the poor girl has been murdered." The murmurs rose into exclamations, gasps, and hurried prayers. Above it all, the night seemed to press closer, as though even the stars leaned down to listen. Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter about her shoulders. She knew, as she had always known, that in villages, no matter how peaceful the lawns, no matter how polite the tea party, human nature would have its secrets. And when secrets pressed too hard against silence, they broke out in tragedy. The crowd shifted nervously, waiting for the constable, for explanations, for anything that might make sense of the dreadful sight. But Miss Marple's eyes were already distant, focused not on the body at her feet, but on the tangle of motives and mysteries that hung invisibly in the warm summer air. And in her mind's quiet certainty, she knew this was only the beginning. By the next morning, the news had swept through St. Mary Mead like a gust of cold wind rattling every window and door. At the grocer's, women leaned across the counter with lowered voices. In the post office, letters were forgotten as villagers clustered in uneasy knots. Even the milkman, usually oblivious to everything save his deliveries, shook his head solemnly and said, "A terrible thing, that poor girl." The words murder and theft mingled in every whispered exchange, though none could quite agree which came first, the taking of the brooch or the taking of Margaret's life. Some insisted she must have been attacked by thieves from outside the village, vagrants wandering through. Others muttered darkly that it was someone closer, someone who knew her well enough to strike in the quiet lane near her own home. Miss Marple, having attended early service at the church, returned along the high street with her usual unhurried step. To the casual passerby, she looked like any other elderly lady going about her errands, but behind her mild blue eyes, her mind was already weighing possibilities. She stopped to purchase bread at Mr. Davies's shop and, as always, heard more than she bought. "It's that brooch, I tell you," Mr. Davies said, slicing a loaf with unnecessary vigor. "Far too grand for her. No good ever comes of flaunting what doesn't belong." His wife, bustling behind him, added in a hushed voice, "They say she wouldn't say where it came from. And no wonder my words were stolen." Miss Marple merely inclined her head, murmuring something about how appearances could be deceiving, and left with her bread tucked neatly under her arm. She had learned long ago that people were rarely so candid as when they believed themselves merely gossiping. At the corner near the green, she encountered Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in her wide-brimmed hat. Mrs. Bantry, who never shied from excitement, was flushed with the thrill of scandal. "My dear Miss Marple, have you heard of it? The constable says there were marks on Margaret's neck. Grip marks," he said. "Oh, how dreadful. But the strangest thing is I heard from Mrs. Bartlett that Margaret was seen just 2 days ago arguing with young Peter Hollis by the pond. Did you know about that?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I had not heard." "No. But young people do quarrel, Mrs. Bantry. A quarrel need not end in tragedy." "Perhaps," Mrs. Bantry replied with an air of mystery. "But if you ask me, Peter Hollis has always had a temper." Miss Marple let the words linger, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. She thought of Peter, the blacksmith's son, broad-shouldered and awkward, often seen lingering about Margaret. Temper, yes, but she also recalled him once rescuing a kitten from the church roof with the gentleness of a child. It would not do to leap to conclusions. By mid-morning, the village square had turned into a stage of speculation. Mrs. Price Ridley declared firmly to anyone who would listen that Margaret's death was a direct result of loose morals encouraged by too much attention from unsuitable quarters. Mr. Pritchard, the churchwarden, countered that it was clearly the work of professional thieves, citing some article he had read about jewel gangs in London, and in the midst of it all, poor Mrs. Elwood sat in her cottage, pale and silent, her grief muffled by the curtains she had drawn against the world. Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to her later that day. She found the little sitting-room dim, smelling faintly of lavender polish. Mrs. Elwood clutched a handkerchief and looked years older than she had the day before. "She was such a good girl, Miss Marple," she whispered. "Never any trouble, always dutiful. I cannot understand why her voice broke." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "I know, my dear. Sometimes the world is cruel in ways we cannot see. Did Margaret speak at all of the brooch to you?" At once, a shadow of distress passed over Mrs. Elwood's face. "She said it was a gift. I pressed her, of course, but she grew so flustered I could not bear to upset her. I thought, well, perhaps she had a beau and was shy of telling me." "Oh, if only I had insisted." Miss Marple reassured her softly, then took her leave, but the words had settled firmly in her thoughts. A gift, yes. But from whom and why? That afternoon, she joined a small group outside the post office, where speculation had reached fever pitch. Several villagers agreed that Peter Hollis must be involved. Others leaned toward the theory that Margaret had been keeping company with someone from outside the parish. One even ventured that a traveling salesman, seen once or twice at the inn, might have been the donor of the mysterious brooch. Through it all, Miss Marple listened, occasionally nodding, her eyes alight with a keen but unspoken interest. For she knew that gossip, however fanciful, often carried small grains of truth hidden within the chaff. It was in the contradictions, the overlaps, and the repeated whispers that one began to discern the pattern. As the church bell tolled the hour, the constable himself appeared in the square, looking decidedly out of his depth. He announced, with great solemnity, that the investigation was underway, that no one was to leave the village, and that all should remain calm. This last instruction, naturally, had the opposite effect. The villagers grew even more excited. When evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting. Outside, the street was hushed, but in her mind, the voices of the day echoed. A gift, a quarrel, a jewel once spoken of in connection with a burglary. Each piece seemed unconnected, and yet Miss Marple knew from long experience that human folly seldom came in isolated fragments. It wove itself into a fabric of cause and consequence. She paused, the needles resting in her lap. Somewhere amid the chatter and contradiction lay the first true thread. She had only to wait for it to reveal itself. And then, just as the clock struck 9, a knock came at her door, not a polite rap, but a hurried, anxious thudding. Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, and opened it. On her doorstep stood Peter Hollis, his face pale, his eyes wild. "Miss Marple," he said hoarsely, "they're saying I killed Margaret, but I swear to you I didn't. You must believe me." Peter Hollis stood in the lamplight of Miss Marple's doorway, his heavy shoulders hunched as though the whole weight of the village's suspicion pressed upon them. His large hands, scarred and rough from years in the forge, twisted at his cap nervously. Miss Marple studied him for a moment in silence before stepping back and motioning him inside. "Come in, Peter," she said gently. "Best not to linger where eyes might see. People do so love to draw conclusions from shadows." Peter obeyed, ducking slightly beneath the lintel. He sat awkwardly on the edge of the chair Miss Marple indicated, his cap clenched tightly between his fists. For a few moments, the ticking of the mantel clock filled the quiet room. "I didn't hurt her," he said suddenly, his voice raw. "They're saying I did Mrs. Price. Ridley told half the village I was quarreling with Margaret, and now no one looks at me straight. But I swear to you, Miss Marple, I never laid a hand on her. Not once." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly, though her eyes remained fixed on him with quiet attentiveness. "Quarreling is not uncommon among young people, Peter, but quarrels have many forms. Tell me, what was the matter with it?" He hesitated, running a hand across his face. "It was about the brooch. That blasted thing. She was wearing it 2 days ago when I met her by the pond. I asked where she got it, and she wouldn't say. Just grew cross and said it was none of my business. I told her it made her look like she was pretending to be something she wasn't. She got angry, said I didn't understand. I suppose I didn't." Miss Marple inclined her head, her voice mild. "So it troubled you, did it?" "The brooch." "Yes," he admitted, almost fiercely. "Because it wasn't right. Margaret was simple and honest. That jewel looked wrong on her, like it didn't belong. I told her to put it away, but she wouldn't." His hands trembled slightly. He looked up at Miss Marple with desperate earnestness. "I cared for her, you see. I never told her properly, but I did. And now she's gone, and everyone says I had cause to strike her down. But I couldn't, Miss Marple. I couldn't." Miss Marple let the words settle. She thought of Peter's temper, often remarked upon, but she also remembered the gentleness with which he had once spoken to a stray dog by the smithy. It was her habit to weigh people not by single moments, but by the sum of many small actions. "Tell me, Peter," she said softly. "On the evening of the garden party, where were you?" "I was in the forge," he replied quickly. "Working late. Father was ill, so I took on the orders. I didn't even know she was walking home till the news came. Ask anyone, they'll tell you they saw the fire burning." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Alibis in villages are curious things. Everyone sees a little. No one sees the whole." Peter leaned forward suddenly, his eyes wide. "You believe me, don't you? You've always seen clearer than the others." Miss Marple placed her knitting in her lap and regarded him with quiet kindness. "Believing, my dear boy, is rather more complicated than you think, but I have no reason, as yet, to doubt your word." Relief flickered in his eyes, but it was brief. He rose abruptly, muttering thanks, and left, his boots heavy upon the step. Miss Marple watched him go, then returned to her knitting, her thoughts looping with the wool. The brooch again, always the brooch. It seemed to gleam brighter in death than it had in life. The following morning, the constable paid a call. Constable Reeves was a stout man, more accustomed to bicycle accidents and complaints about stray hens than murder. His expression was one of harried importance. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he began, tugging his cap. "You've heard, no doubt, that suspicion's fallen heavy on young Hollis. Quarrelled with the girl, seen near her more than once, and with a temper on him. We're obliged to consider him our prime suspect." Miss Marple poured him tea, her manner serene. "It is natural, I suppose, to look at the obvious, but sometimes the obvious is like a bright flower. It hides the weeds beneath." Reeves cleared his throat, looking uneasy. "You mean you don't think it was him?" "I mean," said Miss Marple, stirring her tea with slow precision, "that one must be very cautious with human nature. Appearances deceive. A quarrel may be sharp but harmless, while kindness may cover something altogether darker. We must not decide too soon." The constable frowned, but said nothing more. He left shortly afterward, muttering about statements and evidence. That day the village was alive with rumors. Some claimed Margaret had been seen in the company of a stranger near the inn. Others swore that the brooch was indeed part of a set once stolen in London. And through it all, Peter Hollis's name was whispered, and his figure was watched suspiciously whenever he passed. Miss Marple, for her part, spent the afternoon paying calls. She visited Mrs. Bantry, who was delighted to repeat every scrap of gossip she had heard. She stopped by the grocer's, where Mrs. Davies insisted that Margaret had confided nothing to anyone, and she walked slowly past the Elwoods' cottage, noting with her sharp eyes the drawn curtains, the absence of visitors, and the way Mrs. Elwood's face seemed to have aged a decade overnight. At each place she went, she listened more than she spoke, storing away fragments of tone, expression, and emphasis. It was not what people said that revealed the truth, but what they avoided saying. By evening, she sat again by her window, the knitting resting in her lap. Outside, the lamps were lit, casting long shadows across the lane. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled softly. Her mind returned to Peter's visit, his earnest protestations, and the way his voice had cracked when he spoke of caring for Margaret. Guilty men seldom pleaded so openly. Miss Marple reflected they were more inclined to silence or bluster, and yet innocence alone could not be assumed. The brooch lingered in her thoughts like a shard of glass catching light. A gift, Margaret had said. But gifts, Miss Marple knew, always came with obligations that were sometimes deadly. As she turned down her lamp for the night, a knock rattled at her door once again. This time it was not anxious or hurried, but deliberate, even insistent. When Miss Marple opened it, she found herself face to face with Mrs. Price Ridley, her sharp features set in triumph. "I thought you should know, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "They've found someone who saw Margaret with a man on the evening she died. Not Peter Hollis, a stranger. Tall, dark, and carrying a case. What do you make of that?" Mrs. Price Ridley stood in Miss Marple's doorway like a messenger of doom, her thin lips pinched in satisfaction at being the bearer of important news. Her eyes glinted as she repeated her claim Margaret Elwood had been seen on the evening of her death with a mysterious stranger, tall, dark, and carrying a case. Miss Marple listened politely, her expression mild, though inwardly her mind was already sifting through the information. A stranger, indeed. In villages like St. Mary Mead, where every face was familiar and every errand known, the mere mention of an outsider carried a weight of suspicion. It was all too convenient. A tablet convenience itself often demanded closer scrutiny. Who saw this stranger? Mrs. Price Ridley? Miss Marple asked in her soft voice, the one that had coaxed so many confidences over the years. Mrs. Price Ridley drew herself up importantly. Young Tommy Briggs. He says he was coming back from the allotments when he saw Margaret walking near the church path. A man was with her, carrying a small case, quite unmistakable. Tommy is not one to make up such a thing. Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. Tommy Briggs is a good boy, though easily impressed by the unusual. Did he say what kind of case it was? A case? Oh, some sort of leather bag, I suppose. He wasn't close enough to see more. But really, Miss Marple, does it not strike you as obvious? A stranger appears, a valuable brooch disappears, and poor Margaret is found dead. Why, it all fits together too neatly. Miss Marple gave her a faint smile. Too neatly is often the difficulty, my dear. But thank you for bringing the matter to me. I dare say the constable will want to speak with Tommy at once. Mrs. Price Ridley, disappointed at the lack of dramatic reaction, sniffed and departed, her heels clicking down the lane. When she was gone, Miss Marple sat back in her chair and reflected. A tall, dark stranger with a case. Yes, the village would feast on that tale for days. But she had learned long ago that such sudden appearances were sometimes a smoke screen, a way of shifting suspicion from those much closer to home. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a call on the Briggs family cottage. She found Tommy in the garden, digging half-heartedly at a patch of earth while his mother pegged washing on the line. At the sight of Miss Marple, Tommy straightened, his face both wary and eager. "Good morning, Tommy," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "I hear you had quite an adventure the other evening." His eyes widened. "You mean the man I saw?" "Indeed. Tell me about him, if you please. Leave nothing out, however small." Tommy shifted from one foot to the other, clearly relishing the importance of being questioned. "It was just after sunset. I was coming back from the allotments, and as I passed near the church, I saw Margaret. She was walking with this man. Tall he was, taller than most here, and dark, like his hair was black. He had a bag in his hand, like the sort a doctor might carry. They walked quickly, as if they didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "And what were they doing? Talking? Quarreling?" "I couldn't hear," Tommy admitted. But Margaret didn't look frightened. She was listening closely, like he was telling her something important. "Did you recognize him, Tommy?" The boy shook his head vigorously. "Never saw him before. Not from the village, that's for certain." Miss Marple thanked him kindly, pressing a small coin into his palm, which made his mother beam in gratitude. As she walked back toward the lane, Miss Marple turned over his story in her mind. It was told with the certainty of youth, but certainty was not the same as truth. Later that day, she encountered Colonel Melchett near the post office. The colonel, always ready to play the man of authority, was flushed with the excitement of a mystery on his doorstep. "Ah, Miss Marple, you've heard of this fellow Margaret was seen with, I suppose. Outsider, stranger bound to be up to no good. Reeves is making inquiries already, checking the inn for anyone of that description. We'll have him before long, I shouldn't wonder." Miss Marple replied mildly, "It is very possible, Colonel. But strangers are curious things. They can be useful scapegoats when villagers prefer not to look too closely at their neighbors." The colonel harumphed, clearly unconvinced. "Nonsense, my dear lady. It's just the sort of thing outsiders bring trouble. Mark my words, Reeves will solve it in a trice." Miss Marple let him pass, though her mind lingered on the phrase "in a trice." Quick solutions rarely solve the whole of anything. That evening, she took tea with Mrs. Bantry, who was eager to discuss the latest developments. "They say this stranger came in on the afternoon bus. Mrs. Larkin swears she saw a man of that description getting off with a valise. Could it be the same one? And if so, what business had he had with Margaret?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Strangers do come and go, especially in summer. But it is curious, is it not, that only one person saw Margaret with him, and at a time when shadows lengthen? Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. You mean Tommy could be mistaken? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I mean only that shadows play tricks, and the mind sometimes fills gaps with what it expects. But perhaps the constable's inquiries at the inn will tell us more. The following day, word spread that Reeves had indeed questioned the innkeeper. Yes, a tall, dark man had stayed one night earlier that week, arriving by the afternoon bus. But he had left the next morning, long before Margaret's death. The innkeeper was certain of it. This revelation set the village gossip ablaze once again. Some insisted the innkeeper was mistaken, others that the man must have returned unseen. The stranger grew taller, darker, and more sinister with every telling. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly at her window, knitting in her lap, her thoughts turning not to shadows of strangers, but to the substance of Margaret herself. Why had she accepted the brooch? And from whom? What conversation had passed between her and Peter by the pond? And why, if Tommy Briggs had indeed seen her with a man, had no one else noticed? Her needles clicked softly as she considered. It was not the absence of the brooch that troubled her most. It was the presence of it, brazen and glittering, at the garden party. For Miss Marple knew that people rarely flaunted treasures unless they wished to send a message. And Margaret, sweet and modest Margaret, had surely been sending one. Miss Marple leaned back, the faintest crease of thought between her brows. The tale of the stranger was too convenient, too easily embraced by the village. But until she found the thread that bound Margaret's brooch to her death, the truth would remain tangled in the shadows. As she reached for her lamp, a knock came once again at her door. This time it was not anxious nor triumphant, but hesitant, almost fearful. She opened it to find Mrs. Elwood, Margaret's mother, standing pale and trembling. "Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I found something in Margaret's drawer. A letter, and I don't know what to make of it." Mrs. Elwood stood trembling on Miss Marple's doorstep, the faint glow of the lamp illuminating the lines of grief etched deeper into her face. In her hands she clutched an envelope, the edges softened as if it had been handled many times. Her eyes, red from weeping, darted nervously toward the lane as though fearful of being seen. "Come inside, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, ushering her into the sitting-room where the familiar scent of lavender polish and wool hung in the air. She guided the widow to a chair and placed a cup of tea before her. Only when Mrs. Elwood's trembling eased slightly did Miss Marple motion toward the envelope. "It was in Margaret's drawer," Mrs. Elwood whispered. "I didn't mean to pry, but I felt I must, and now I don't know what to think." Miss Marple took the letter with careful fingers. The paper was plain and folded twice, but the handwriting inside was bold, with an elegance that seemed foreign to the modest lives of St. Mary Mead. She adjusted her spectacles and read aloud softly so Mrs. Elwood could hear once more. "Dearest Margaret, the time draws near when you must decide. You know the brooch is not merely an ornament, but a token. With it comes responsibility, and danger too, should it fall into the wrong hands. Trust no one but me. Destroy this note after reading. I shall expect you where we agreed. Yours, ever, C." Miss Marple folded the letter again, her brows drawn together in quiet thought. The words were curious, both intimate and ominous. Responsibility, danger, and a command to trust no one but the writer. "Did Margaret ever mention anyone with an initial C?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Elwood shook her head. "Never. She was a good girl, quiet and obedient. If there was someone she cared for, I knew nothing of it." Her voice broke again. "Oh, Miss Marple, does this mean she was keeping secrets from me? That she was in trouble?" Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on the woman's arm. "All young people keep secrets, my dear. It is the nature of youth. But secrets do not always mean wrongdoing. Sometimes they are born of fear or of loyalty to someone undeserving of it. Mrs. Elwood dabbed at her eyes. "What shall I do with it? The constable will twist it into something dreadful, I'm sure." "Let me hold it for now," Miss Marple said kindly. "It may be wiser to consider before rushing into conclusions. Letters, after all, can be misleading, sometimes by what they say, sometimes by what they do not." Mrs. Elwood agreed with visible relief. She left soon after, her figure stooped and weary as she disappeared into the shadows of the lane. Miss Marple remained seated, the letter resting lightly in her lap, her mind circling around its contents. The brooch was a token, the writer had said. A token of what? Not affection alone. Surely there was too much weight in the phrasing. Responsibility, danger. These were not the words of a lovesick youth, nor of any villager she knew. The following day, the village throbbed with fresh speculation. Word of a letter had already leaked out, though how Mrs. Price Ridley had contrived to know of it so quickly, Miss Marple could only guess. At the grocer's, Mrs. Bantry whispered that Margaret had been engaged in some romantic entanglement. At the post office, Mr. Pritchard muttered that the brooch must be part of some criminal conspiracy. Each theory grew more elaborate, with the telling weaving Margaret's quiet life into a tapestry of intrigue. Miss Marple, however, kept her own counsel. She paid a quiet call at the Elwoods' shop, where she found Margaret's younger brother, George, stacking bolts of fabric with distracted hands. His eyes were red, though he tried to mask it with brusque speech. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," he said quickly, before she could speak. "We've told the constable everything we know, but it seems never enough. They're set on Peter Hollis, aren't they?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied. "But investigations have a way of shifting. Tell me, George, did Margaret ever mention a friend, someone she wrote to? Someone perhaps outside the village?" George frowned, scratching his head. "Not that I know of. She got a few letters now and then, but she never said from whom. Once I asked, and she only laughed, said it was nothing, but she was restless these last weeks, I'll admit. Nervous, too. Kept looking over her shoulder, like she expected someone." This confession deepened the mystery. Restless, nervous, letters kept secret, Margaret had been carrying a burden no one in her family understood. And the brooch, far from being a trinket of vanity, might well have been the heart of it. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Bantry for tea. She knew Mrs. Bantry's appetite for gossip was insatiable, and such appetites often unearthed useful scraps. "My dear," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed the moment Miss Marple was seated, "you simply must hear this." Mrs. Larkin swears she overheard Margaret speaking to someone near the vicarage a week ago. She couldn't see who it was, but Margaret said, "I can't keep it hidden forever. They'll find out." "What do you think of that?" Miss Marple sipped her tea calmly. "I think, my dear, that overheard words are like scraps of knitting. They may look one way, but only when the whole piece is complete do you know the pattern." Still, inwardly, she acknowledged the significance. Margaret had feared discovery. Discovery of what? The brooch, the letter, or the identity of C. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the letter once again in her hands. She examined the handwriting closely. It was firm, with flourishes, not the hand of a villager unaccustomed to penmanship. It suggested education, perhaps even refinement. Could it be the hand of someone from outside, an acquaintance from London perhaps? Or worse, someone from nearer by, hiding behind an initial to mask their involvement? She thought of the brooch again, gleaming in the sun at the garden party, catching every eye. It had not been an accident that Margaret wore it then. It had been a signal, a message, a declaration of some kind. To whom and for what purpose was still shrouded. As the clock struck 9, Miss Marple placed the letter carefully in a small box on her writing desk. She had no intention of showing it to the constable yet, not until she better understood its place in the puzzle. Too many innocent lives had been blighted in the past by premature conclusions. Just as she rose to draw the curtains, there came a hurried knock at the door. Not Mrs. Elwood this time, nor the constable, but young George Elwood, breathless and pale. "Miss Marple," he gasped, clutching the door frame. "You must come quickly. They found something else near the lane, something Margaret dropped. It's not the brooch, it's a key." George Elwood's words seemed to hang in the air, more chilling than the evening breeze that rustled the curtains. Miss Marple, calm though she appeared, felt a keen stir of interest as she reached for her shawl. "Show me where, George," she said at once, and he nodded, urgency in every line of his young face. They walked quickly through the dim lanes, the lamps casting long shadows. Villagers had already begun to gather near the site of discovery, voices rising in speculation. Mrs. Bantry was there, as was Mrs. Price Ridley, both eager to be the first to interpret the new evidence. Constable Reeves, stout and flustered, was attempting to keep order, though with little success. The object itself lay on a small square of cloth upon the ground, illuminated by a lantern. It was a key chain, brass and worn from use, its bow smooth and oval. Not the dainty key of a jewelry casket, but sturdier, the sort that might fit a desk drawer or a private lockbox. Miss Marple bent over it, her keen eyes studying the details. "Who found it?" she asked. "Tommy Briggs again," Reeves replied, scratching his head. "Boys are always poking about. He said he saw it shining in the dirt when he passed this way earlier." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. Doubtless she dropped it in her struggle. A secret tryst, a quarrel, and then murder. It all follows. Miss Marple straightened, her hands folded lightly on her shawl. Perhaps. But keys, Mrs. Price Ridley, are curious things. They tell us not only what is locked, but also who has the right to open it. Her words drew a few puzzled looks, but she let them pass. She knew better than to explain herself too soon. The villagers soon dispersed, grumbling and whispering. Reeves pocketed the key with the promise of making inquiries, though he did not seem to know quite where to begin. George Elwood walked home in silence beside Miss Marple, his face pale. "Do you think it belonged to Margaret, ma'am?" he asked at last. "It is possible," Miss Marple replied. "But if it was hers, the question is, what did she keep locked? And if it was not hers, then who wished her to carry it?" At home, she sat by her fire long after George had gone, the image of the key sharp in her mind. She thought of the letter, of the phrase responsibility and danger, of Margaret's restlessness in her final weeks. There was something Margaret had guarded, something beyond the brooch itself. The next morning, Miss Marple went to the Elwoods' cottage. Mrs. Elwood received her with weary gratitude, while George lingered awkwardly by the door. "I wonder, Mrs. Elwood," Miss Marple said gently, "whether Margaret had any locked drawers, boxes, or perhaps a case of her own. Somewhere she kept her private things." Mrs. Elwood looked startled. Why, yes, she had a small wooden box in her room. It was her grandmother's. Always kept it locked, though I never thought much of it. "May I see it?" Upstairs, in Margaret's neat little bedroom, Miss Marple found the box on the dresser. It was a simple wooden chest, worn smooth by years of handling. The lock was old but sturdy. Miss Marple examined it, her fingers brushing the edges. "Yes," she murmured. This might well match the key, but when Reeves arrived, the key was tried, and it did not fit. "Too small," Reeves muttered, jiggling it, uselessly. "Doesn't belong here." George frowned. She never had anything else locked, not that I know of. Miss Marple remained silent, but her mind was alive with possibilities. The key belonged elsewhere. Somewhere important. Somewhere connected not to the Elwoods, but to whoever had given Margaret the brooch. That afternoon, she walked through the village, her eyes noting details others overlooked. The locked drawers behind the counter at the draper's, the private cupboards in the vicarage, and even the strong box at the inn. Keys abounded in village life, but few were small and brass like the one Tommy Briggs had found. On the green, she met Mrs. Bantry again, who was eager with more chatter. "I hear Reeves is sending the key to be examined in Much Benham." "Nonsense," I say. "Any locksmith could tell you the same." "But do you know, Miss Marple, I recall seeing Margaret once with a small square parcel under her arm, like a box." She looked so flustered when I asked about it, I thought it best not to pry. Miss Marple tucked this away, her mind knitting it into the growing fabric. A parcel, a box, a letter that spoke of responsibility, and now a key. All parts of a pattern. That evening she sat by her window once more. Outside, the village seemed hushed, subdued by the weight of tragedy. The stranger with the case had faded somewhat in the gossip, replaced now by speculation about hidden treasures and secret locks. Reeves still pressed Peter Hollis with questions, convinced the quarrel was motive enough, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered elsewhere. Margaret had been entrusted with something that required a key, something that had made her nervous, restless, and finally, fearful. The brooch was not the heart of it, but the lure, the symbol, perhaps even the bait. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, her eyes thoughtful. If she could discover what the key unlocked, she would be closer to uncovering the truth. But keys, like secrets, seldom revealed themselves easily. As the church bell tolled 9, a soft rap sounded at her door. It was George once more, pale and anxious. "Miss Marple," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "I think I know where the key fits. Margaret went there once, late at night. She told me never to follow. It's the old gardener's shed behind the vicarage." George Elwood's revelation lingered in Miss Marple's mind long after he had hurried off into the night. The gardener's shed behind the vicarage, an old, half-forgotten structure that few ever approached, except when tools were needed, was not the sort of place one would normally associate with secrets. And yet, how often had she learned that the most ordinary of places held the most extraordinary truths? The following morning, Miss Marple set out with quiet purpose. The vicarage gardens were peaceful, dew still clinging to the grass, the roses nodding gently in the soft breeze. The vicar himself, Mr. Clement, greeted her with his usual mild courtesy. "Good morning, Miss Marple. You're abroad early. Is there something I may do for you?" "Only a small favor," she replied, her tone as casual as if she were asking for tea. "Might I have a look at the gardener's shed? I recall that Margaret Elwood once spent time there. It may perhaps be of interest." The vicar blinked in surprise, but offered no objection. "Certainly, though I confess I cannot imagine what you'll find. It's mostly spades and rakes, nothing more." Miss Marple smiled politely. "It is surprising what one sometimes finds among rakes and spades." With the vicar's key in hand, she approached the shed. The structure stood tucked behind a hedge, its timbers weathered, the padlock dulled with rust. She tried the vicar's key first. It did not fit. Then, with a calm certainty, she withdrew the brass key found in the lane. It slipped smoothly into the lock. A soft click followed, and the door creaked open. Inside, the air smelled of earth and old wood. Tools leaned against the walls, pots were stacked haphazardly, and a few coils of rope lay in a heap. At first glance, it seemed no different from any gardener's shed. But Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and patient, began to note details that were not quite ordinary. In the corner, partially hidden beneath a sack, stood a small iron-bound chest. Dust clung to it, but the edges showed signs of recent handling. She bent closer, fingers brushing the lid. It was locked, of course, but the same brass key turned within it as though it belonged there. The lid creaked open. Inside lay papers, neatly tied with string. and on top of them an envelope addressed in the same bold hand as Margaret's secret letter. Miss Marple drew it out, her heart steady though her curiosity quickened. The paper bore no name, only a short line to be delivered upon my instruction. Beneath it, the bundle of papers bore seals and crests she recognized faintly. Legal documents, perhaps deeds or letters of value. But why here, and why in Margaret's keeping? As she leaned closer, she heard footsteps outside. Quickly, she replaced the papers, closed the chest, and locked it again. When the door opened, Constable Reeves appeared, his round face flushed from exertion. "Miss Marple, I thought I might find you poking about here. George Elwood said something about this shed. Did you find it?" Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. "Only that the key fits here, Constable. Margaret had access to this shed, which is in itself curious. It may be wise to keep a close watch on its contents." Reeves scratched his head. "Strange, that. Can't see why the girl would come here of all places. Unless she was meeting someone." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "That is indeed possible." Reeves seemed satisfied enough to leave her to her thoughts, but Miss Marple knew she had only glimpsed the surface of something deeper. Margaret had been entrusted with those papers, of which she felt sure. The letter had spoken of responsibility and danger, and such words did not belong to trifles. That afternoon, the village buzzed again with speculation. Word had spread quickly that the key opened the gardener's shed. Mrs. Bantry declared that Margaret must have been hiding stolen goods. Mr. Pritchard insisted it was proof of her connection to the mysterious stranger. And Mrs. Price Ridley, with relish, suggested that Peter Hollis had used the shed for clandestine meetings. Miss Marple listened quietly to it all, her thoughts working far beyond the chatter. She knew human nature too well to dismiss any possibility, but she also knew that truth often lay not in the loudest accusations, but in the small inconsistencies. In the evening, as she sat with her knitting, she reviewed what she had seen in the shed. The chest, the papers, and the envelope were not the possessions of a village girl. They suggested something larger, something reaching beyond St. Mary Mead. And yet it was Margaret who had carried the burden. Why? The answer, she suspected, lay in the identity of C, the writer of the letter, the giver of the brooch, the one who had bound Margaret into silence. Whoever C was, he or she was at the heart of the mystery. Her musings were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Peter Hollis standing there once again. His face was pale, his eyes troubled. "Miss Marple," he said hoarsely, "they say the shed proves I was meeting Margaret there. But it isn't true. I never stepped foot in it. You have to believe me." Miss Marple regarded him with her quiet, searching gaze. "Do not trouble yourself, Peter. I do not believe you guilty because others say so. But did Margaret ever speak of anyone whose name began with C?" Peter hesitated, then shook his head slowly. "No, but once. She told me she was keeping something safe for someone. She looked frightened when she said it. I asked who, but she wouldn't tell me." Miss Marple's needles clicked once more, her mind knitting the pattern tighter. The brooch, the letter, the chest in the shed are all connected, all threads leading to the unseen figure of C. As Peter left, the night seemed heavier than before. Miss Marple rose, gazing out at the darkened street. Somewhere among the whispers of the village and the shadows of the hedgerows, the truth was waiting, and she knew that before long another hand might reach out to silence it. The discovery of the gardener's shed had set the village buzzing once again, though few knew the full truth of what lay inside. Miss Marple, who had seen enough to recognize the gravity of the matter, kept her counsel, for she knew all too well the dangers of feeding a fire with more fuel than necessary. Still, she could not quiet the thought of those papers, and the mysterious figure who had entrusted Margaret with them. The brooch had been only the glittering surface. The real weight of the Affair lay locked within that chest. The next day dawned bright and deceptively calm, but the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead was far from peaceful. Constable Reeves trudged about with an air of harried self-importance, dropping hints of serious evidence while avoiding direct answers. Mrs. Price Ridley spoke loudly in the grocer's that Margaret must have been involved in something unsavory, while Mrs. Bantry confided to anyone who would listen that the shed proved there had been nightly meetings between Margaret and some dark stranger. Miss Marple, meanwhile, moved quietly from one end of the village to the other, listening more than she spoke. Each repetition of the story altered some detail. One moment the stranger was a doctor, the next a foreigner, the next a thief from London. Such embroideries were inevitable, but the constancy of one thread troubled her. The name of Peter Hollis remained upon everyone's lips. By the afternoon she made her way once again to the vicarage. The shed, locked once more by Constable Reeves, looked as innocent as any outbuilding could, yet Miss Marple knew that secrets seldom remained confined for long. She intended to ask the vicar if anyone had made unusual use of the shed before Margaret's death. But before she reached his study, a commotion erupted near the churchyard. Voices called out, feet hurried across the grass, and Miss Marple followed at her measured pace. At the gate, a crowd had already gathered. A man lay crumpled by the lych gate, blood trickling from a wound on his temple. It was Reeves. Gasps rose from the onlookers. "An accident!" someone exclaimed. "He must have tripped!" cried another. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes told her otherwise. The angle of his fall, the stone near his head, and the absence of grazing on his hands suggested he had not fallen at all. With the help of the vicar, Reeves was carried into the church hall where a doctor was summoned. The constable, dazed but conscious, muttered incoherently about being struck from behind. "Did you see who it was?" Miss Marple asked softly when she had a chance to lean near him. Reeves shook his head, wincing with pain. "Not only did I feel it, a blow, then nothing, but it was near the shed. I'd gone to check the lock again." A hush fell over the gathering. For the first time, fear replaced curiosity in the villagers' eyes. A thief might steal, a quarrel might end in tragedy, but an attack on the constable was something darker. It meant someone was desperate enough to silence even the law. That evening, the village swarmed with speculation. Mrs. Price Ridley insisted Peter Hollis had struck Reeves to cover his guilt. Others murmured about the mysterious stranger returning under cover of night. The air was thick with suspicion, every shadow lengthening into menace. Miss Marple, however, saw the matter differently. Reeves's injury was not the act of a man fleeing blindly, but of one who knew the constable might stumble too close to the truth. And that truth lay in the shed and in the documents hidden within. Later, in the quiet of her own sitting room, she considered what she had witnessed. Margaret had been entrusted with responsibility, the letter said. The brooch had been a token, perhaps even a signal. The chest in the shed held documents someone did not wish to discover, and now Reeves, the one man who had authority to examine them, had been attacked. She thought back to Margaret herself, her unease at the garden party, her refusal to name the giver of the brooch, and her nervous glances in recent weeks. Margaret had been neither a thief nor a liar. She had been frightened, and fear, Miss Marple knew, often pointed to someone close. As she set down her knitting and prepared for bed, her mind returned once more to the enigmatic C. Whoever he was, he had placed Margaret in danger, whether by intention or through reckless trust. And now, with Reeves struck down, the danger had spread wider still. Miss Marple blew out her lamp, her face calm though her mind was racing. Somewhere among the chatter, the half-truths, and the shadows of the village lay the pattern she sought. The brooch, the key, the shed, and the papers all were stitches in a design not yet clear. But she felt certain of one thing. The hand that had silenced Margaret was not finished yet. Outside, the night settled heavily upon St. Mary Mead. The villagers locked their doors more tightly, and whispers floated under eaves. Miss Marple sat awake in the dark a little longer, listening to the silence. She knew too well that silence was seldom empty. It was only waiting for the next sound, and as the clock struck midnight, there came the faint but unmistakable creak of footsteps passing her garden gate. The creak of footsteps outside her garden gate was soft, almost tentative, but Miss Marple had lived too long in St. Mary Mead not to notice such things. She rose from her chair with the silent swiftness of a cat, drew her shawl tightly about her shoulders, and extinguished the lamp. In darkness, she moved to the window and parted the curtain just enough to peer into the lane. At first, she saw nothing. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she caught the shadowy outline of a figure moving along the hedge. The gait was careful and deliberate, as if the walker was anxious not to be heard. Whoever it was, they paused near her gate, looked toward her cottage, and then continued in the direction of the vicarage. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She knew better than to step out at once, but her instincts told her the shed was the destination. She waited a moment, then reached for her stout walking stick and slipped out into the night. The village was hushed, every window dark, every door bolted. The figure ahead moved with purpose, and Miss Marple, though slow of step, followed steadily, keeping to the shadows. By the time she reached the edge of the vicarage grounds, the intruder had disappeared behind the hedge. Miss Marple stood very still, her sharp ears straining. Then she heard the faint scrape of metal against wood. The shed's lock. She crept closer, heart beating with quiet determination. A lantern flickered briefly within, and for the smallest moment she saw a hand rifling through the chest inside. The light was extinguished almost immediately, and the figure slipped out again, moving quickly across the grass. Miss Marple, not wishing to be discovered, drew back into the shadows. The intruder passed so near she could almost feel the rush of air. She caught a glimpse of a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark coat. He carried something tucked close under his arm, something the size of a parcel. She did not follow further. Age had taught her the wisdom of patience. Instead, she returned to her cottage and sat once more by her fire. The shed had been entered, the chest disturbed, and something removed. Reeves, lying bruised from his attack, would wake to find his one piece of evidence stolen from under his nose. In the morning, her fears were confirmed. The constable, pale but upright, appeared at her door, agitation written across his face. "It's gone, Miss Marple," he said grimly. The chest in the shed emptied. Not a paper left. "How very unfortunate," Miss Marple replied gently, though her tone suggested it was not unexpected. "And what of the lock?" "Forced," Reeves admitted. "Clean as anything. Whoever it was knew what they were about." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Knowledge is often more dangerous than force, constable, especially when it is used in haste." The news spread quickly through the village. By noon, every tongue wagged with theories. Mrs. Price Ridley declared that Peter Hollis must have taken the papers to conceal his guilt. Mr. Pritchard argued that the stranger had returned under cover of darkness. Mrs. Bantry whispered that Margaret had been entangled in some political matter. Spies, you know. One hears such things these days. Miss Marple, as usual, listened, stored away their words, and smiled politely. She had no intention of sharing what she herself had witnessed. The shadow at her gate, the careful footsteps, and the parcel carried away. Knowledge, too freely spoken, often did more harm than good. Later that day, she paid a quiet call upon the vicarage. Mr. Clement received her with grave concern. "It is dreadful, Miss Marple, dreadful. To think that our humble shed should be made the scene of burglary, and perhaps worse. Poor Margaret, if only she had confided in someone." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Confidence is not always easy to give, especially when one fears the listener may not understand." The vicar looked puzzled, but she offered no further explanation. Instead, she asked after the gardener's routine. Who used the shed and when? Mr. Clement assured her that since the gardener's retirement months ago, the shed had been scarcely touched, save for the occasional use of tools. And no one, to your knowledge, had reason to keep a chest there, she pressed. Certainly not, he replied, his brow furrowing. It is most extraordinary. Miss Marple left with a thoughtful air. Extraordinary indeed, yet also curiously ordinary in its method. Hide something in plain sight in the most unremarkable of places, and it might remain unnoticed for years. But Margaret had known. Margaret had been chosen or persuaded to guard it. That evening, Miss Marple sat at her window once more, knitting untouched in her lap. Her thoughts turned to Margaret, to the brooch glittering on her dress at the garden party, and to the fear in her eyes when asked about it. Margaret had been burdened with knowledge too great for her, and someone both cunning and ruthless had silenced her to keep that knowledge safe. The pieces were falling into place, though the final pattern was not yet clear. The figure of C loomed larger in her mind than ever. The writer of the letter, the one who had spoken of responsibility and danger, had set this chain of events in motion. But who was he? And was he still in the village, moving silently beneath its watchful eyes? As the clock struck 10, a knock sounded at her door. It was Mrs. Bantry, breathless with urgency. "Miss Marple, come quickly. There's been another discovery by the mill this time. A man's glove, stained with blood." Mrs. Bantry's breathless announcement sent a ripple of alarm through Miss Marple's quiet sitting room. A glove, discovered near the mill and stained with blood, such a detail could not fail to ignite the imaginations of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, however, rose with her usual composure, fetched her shawl, and followed Mrs. Bantry into the night. The mill lay at the edge of the village, its wheel long stilled, its timbers creaking in the wind. By the time they arrived, a small group of villagers had already gathered, lanterns casting long, shifting shadows across the ground. Constable Reeves, pale from his recent injury, but stubbornly insistent on duty, stood guard over the discovery. The glove lay on the damp earth near the mill's stone wall. It was a man's glove of good quality leather, but worn at the seams. A dark stain marked its cuff and spread across the palm. Blood, no doubt about it. Miss Marple stooped with care, her sharp eyes studying the object without touching it. "A right-hand glove," she murmured softly, "and well used. See the wear here, where the thumb meets the palm. A working man, perhaps, but not one accustomed to heavy labor. More the sort of man who uses his hands often, yet with some delicacy." Reeves looked doubtful. "It could be anyone's, Miss Marple. Plenty of men wear gloves." "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly, "but not plenty who would drop one so conveniently near a scene of alarm. Dropped items are often more revealing than they appear." Mrs. Price Ridley, who had elbowed her way to the front, gave a sharp sniff. "It proves what I've said all along, that Hollis boy is guilty. Who else would wear such gloves? Blacksmiths' sons are strong men, always in need of hand coverings." Miss Marple raised her eyes, her tone deceptively gentle. "I should have thought, Mrs. Price Ridley, that a blacksmith's son might wear thicker, rougher gloves, ones designed to resist sparks and flame. This is finer leather, perhaps more suited to a gentleman." The remark caused a stir, and Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips, unwilling to argue further. Reeves gathered up the glove with exaggerated care and promised to make inquiries. But already the speculation had begun. By morning, the story of the glove had spread like wildfire. In the post office, villagers whispered that the blood must belong to the murderer, injured in his struggle with Margaret. At the grocer's, others insisted it proved Reeves's attacker had returned, wounded and desperate. Theories piled upon one another until no one could distinguish sense from fancy. Miss Marple, meanwhile, walked quietly through the village, piecing together the fragments. She thought of Margaret's letter, the chest in the shed, and the footsteps she herself had heard. A glove stained with blood was not merely a clue, but a statement. Someone had wished it was found. That afternoon, she paid a visit to the inn. The innkeeper, a ruddy-cheeked man with a sharp memory, was eager to speak. "Ah, Miss Marple, you'll be asking about that stranger, I suppose." "Yes, he wore gloves. Smart ones, too. He seemed like a gentleman. He asked plenty of questions about the village, but kept himself to himself otherwise. Left early, as I told the constable. But now, with that glove, well, perhaps he didn't leave after all." Miss Marple inclined her head, storing away his words. A gentleman, gloves, questions. And yet the timing did not fit. The stranger had supposedly left before Margaret's death. Unless he had returned unseen, the glove belonged to someone closer. In the evening, she called upon Mrs. Elwood once more. The poor woman sat in her dim parlour, clutching a handkerchief as though it were her only anchor. "They say they've found a glove," she whispered, "belonging to the one who killed my girl. Oh, Miss Marple, will there ever be an end to this?" Miss Marple spoke softly. "There will, my dear. Truth has a way of surfacing, though sometimes slower than we wish. Tell me, did Margaret ever receive gifts other than the brooch? Clothing, perhaps? Or accessories?" Mrs. Elwood frowned, thinking hard. "Once, a pair of gloves. She said they were too fine for her, and she put them away in a drawer. I only remembered when you asked. They were light leather, like the one they speak of now." Miss Marple felt a quiet thrill of recognition. "And did Margaret say from whom they came?" "No," Mrs. Elwood admitted sadly. "Only that they were sent." She said nothing more. When Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind was clear. The glove was not proof of Peter Hollis's guilt, nor of some faceless stranger's presence. It was connected to the same hand that had given Margaret the brooch, and perhaps the letter too. Each gift token bound her closer to a secret she had not chosen. As Miss Marple prepared for bed, she considered the pattern. Margaret had been drawn into a game beyond her understanding. The brooch, the gloves, the letter, and the chest are all threads tied to a hidden figure, someone clever enough to hide behind initials and convenient alibis. But cleverness always left its mark. She was not surprised when, just as she settled by the fire, a new knock came at her door. George Elwood stood there, pale and trembling, holding out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I found this in Margaret's things," he whispered. "Hidden under the floorboard. It's addressed to someone else, addressed to C." George Elwood stood in the doorway, clutching the brown paper parcel as if it might burn his hands. His face was pale, his voice little more than a whisper. "It was under the floorboard, Miss Marple. I don't know how long it's been there, but it was well hidden. And look, it's not even addressed to Margaret. It's addressed to someone else. To C." Miss Marple motioned him inside and closed the door. She studied the parcel closely. It was small, no larger than a book, wrapped with care, the twine tied in a firm knot. Across the paper, in bold handwriting, was a single initial C. No name, no address, nothing more. "Where exactly did you find it, George?" she asked gently. "In her room," he said, "under the floorboard by the bed. I only discovered it because I dropped a button and it rolled into the crack. The board lifted when I tried to reach for it. I thought at first it might be money she'd saved, but when I saw the writing, well, I thought of you at once." Miss Marple gave a small, approving nod. "Very wise, my dear. It was right you brought it to me." She placed the parcel on the table, her fingers lightly tracing the twine. Her mind worked swiftly. A brooch given as a token, gloves too fine for a village girl, a letter urging secrecy, warning of danger, papers hidden in a chest, and now a parcel addressed to C. Margaret had been holding things that belonged not to her, but to someone who had used her trust as cover. "Did you open it?" Miss Marple asked quietly. George shook his head. "No, I thought I shouldn't. But if it can help find who did this to her," his voice faltered and he looked away. Miss Marple reached for her scissors and, with deliberate care, snipped the twine. The paper fell aside to reveal a slim box, its surface worn but sturdy. When she opened it, both she and George leaned forward. Inside were more documents, folded neatly, and a small velvet pouch. She lifted one of the papers, scanning it quickly. It bore seals, signatures, and dates, legal documents, deeds, and perhaps even bonds. They were written in the kind of formal language few in the village would understand, but Miss Marple recognized enough to know they concerned money and ownership. Margaret had indeed been safeguarding something of value. Next, she opened the pouch. Out tumbled a pair of earrings, sapphires set in delicate silver, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. George caught his breath. "Jewels?" he whispered. "Is that what all this is about?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. "But jewels alone are seldom worth murder. It is what they represent that drives men and women to desperate acts." She replaced the items carefully, tying the twine once more. Her mind turned back to Margaret's letter. The writer had spoken of responsibility, of danger if the brooch fell into the wrong hands. Margaret had been trusted, perhaps coerced, into keeping these items hidden. Whoever C was, they had placed her in a perilous position. George watched her anxiously. "Should I take it to the constable?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said firmly. "We must understand more before we place it in official hands. Reeves has already been attacked once. To reveal too soon may only invite more violence." George swallowed and nodded. He trusted her judgment. The next morning, Miss Marple walked through the village with her usual air of harmless purpose. Yet inside, her thoughts moved swiftly. The presence of legal papers and jewels suggested something greater than a simple theft or quarrel. It hinted at inheritance, at claims disputed, perhaps even at blackmail. And the brooch, worn so publicly at the garden party, might have been meant as a signal message to C or to others involved. At the grocer's, she lingered long enough to hear Mrs. Price Ridley declare with relish that the glove proved Peter Hollis's guilt beyond doubt. At the post office, Mr. Pritchard muttered about gangs of jewel thieves. At the inn, the keeper repeated his story of the dark-haired stranger, now embellishing it with details of a scar on the man's cheek. Miss Marple listened, smiling faintly, but her mind was far away. By afternoon she paid a call at the vicarage. Mr. Clement welcomed her warmly, though his face was troubled. "This business has cast a dreadful pall, Miss Marple. Poor Margaret, and now Reeves nearly killed, and whispers of spies and smugglers. I fear the village is quite unsettled." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Whispers often grow in the absence of truth, Mr. Clement, but the truth will out, sooner or later. Tell me, has anyone been attending services of late? Or perhaps anyone taking sudden interest in parish matters?" The vicar thought hard. "Now you mention it, there was a gentleman who came 2 Sundays past, sat near the back, very quiet. I did not recognize him, and he did not stay to speak. Tall, dark hair. I assumed he was visiting." Miss Marple tucked the detail away. "A stranger, yes, but a stranger who sought not the inn, but the church. Interesting indeed." That evening, back in her cottage, she examined the parcel again, her mind working over every detail. The handwriting on the wrapping matched the letter signed C. Whoever had written it was the same person who had placed Margaret in peril. And now, with Reeves struck down and the chest in the shed emptied, the urgency was clear. Someone was tying up loose ends, and Margaret had been the first. As she set the parcel aside, a knock rattled at the door. This time it was Constable Reeves, still pale but resolute. "Miss Marple," he said, lowering his voice, There's been talk of a meeting place near the old quarry. Some say Margaret went there the night before she died. I'm going to look into it tonight. Might be dangerous, but I can't ignore it." Miss Marple regarded him with her calm, piercing eyes. "Be careful, Constable. Danger often comes when one is certain they are on the right path. And remember, sometimes it is not the stranger we should fear most, but the neighbor who knows when and where to strike." Reeves nodded, though uneasily, and departed into the dark. Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting untouched. She felt in her bones that the end was drawing closer. The brooch, the glove, the key, and the parcel all pointed to the same hidden hand. And now, if Reeves was not careful, that hand might strike again before the truth was revealed. The quarry lay half a mile beyond the village, a scar in the earth left long abandoned, its chalky walls stark against the night sky. Few villagers ventured there after dark, for the ground was treacherous and the stillness had about it an uneasy air. But on this night, Constable Reeves, still bearing the bruise from his earlier assault, trudged doggedly toward it. He believed himself close to uncovering the mystery that had gripped Saint. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, however, did not sleep. She had seen too many hasty investigations end in tragedy. And though Reeves had not invited her, she had slipped quietly from her cottage and followed at a distance, her steps steady, her shawl pulled tightly against the chill. The path grew narrower as it approached the quarry, the hedges pressing close. Ahead, Reeves's lantern bobbed, a wavering glow in the darkness. Miss Marple kept well back, careful not to reveal her presence, though her heart quickened. She knew in her bones that if Margaret had come here, it was not by accident. At the edge of the quarry, Reeves paused. The great hollow spread before him, pale and ghostly in the moonlight. The silence was deep, broken only by the faint trickle of water seeping through the stone. Reeves raised his lantern higher and began to descend the narrow path that wound to the bottom. Miss Marple hesitated at the rim, then followed slowly, careful of her footing. She kept to the shadows, her sharp eyes fixed on the constable below. Reeves moved methodically, sweeping his lantern across the ground. At first he saw nothing but scattered stones and weeds. Then his light caught on something half buried in the dust. He bent, brushing it free. It was a scrap of fine muslin cloth, torn and faintly stained. Reeves held it up, frowning. Margaret's dress had been muslin, a remnant, perhaps, from the night of her death. Before he could ponder further, a sound broke the stillness, the crunch of a footstep, not his own. Reeves swung round sharply, the lantern raised. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing against the quarry wall. No answer came, only another step, closer now, and the faint gleam of movement in the shadows. Reeves drew himself up, trying to sound authoritative. "Show yourself. This is official business." Miss Marple, crouched higher on the path, felt the prickle of dread along her spine. The air itself seemed to tighten. A figure emerged at last, tall, broad-shouldered, with a dark coat thrown about him. Reeves stepped forward, demanding a name. But before he could speak again, the stranger lunged. There was a struggle. The lantern toppled, its light flaring wildly, and shadows leaping across the chalk. Reeves cried out as he was shoved back against the stones. Miss Marple clutched her shawl tightly, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment she feared Reeves would be thrown into the pit, but with surprising resilience, he grappled back, his hands locking around the man's arm. The stranger wrenched free, striking Reeves hard enough to send him staggering. Then, without a word, he fled into the darkness, disappearing up the quarry path with long, rapid strides. Reeves groaned, stooping to retrieve his lantern, which now flickered weakly. Miss Marple, calm despite her pounding heart, descended the last stretch and approached him. "Miss Marple," Reeves exclaimed, startled. "What on earth?" "I could not let you come alone," she said simply, "and it is fortunate I did, else we might be carrying you back rather than walking." Reeves muttered something about duty, but his voice shook. He looked at the scrap of muslin still clutched in his hand. This proves it, doesn't it? Margaret was here. And that man must be the one she met, the one who killed her. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the cloth. Perhaps. But scraps of fabric do not tell us who tore them, nor why. And as for the man, did you see his face? Reeves shook his head bitterly. Too dark. Only his size, his strength, tall, broad. That fits Hollis, doesn't it? Miss Marple's expression softened, but her voice carried quiet firmness. It might fit Hollis or half a dozen others. Let us not fall into the trap of fitting the facts to the man we suspect, rather than fitting the man to the facts we have. They climbed back together, the lantern casting long shadows that seemed to reach after them. At the top, Reeves sat heavily on a stone, breathing hard. Miss Marple stood beside him, her mind working rapidly. The man had risked much to be here tonight. Why return to the quarry unless something vital was hidden there? The muslin scrap might be genuine, or it might have been planted to mislead. And the figure of C, whoever he was, remained just beyond reach. When Reeves had recovered enough to walk, they returned slowly to the village. The constable, battered and disheartened, muttered about reporting the incident at once. Miss Marple said little, but her mind was racing. She recalled Margaret's words, overheard by Mrs. Larkin. I can't keep it hidden forever. They'll find out. Perhaps it was here, in the quarry, that Margaret had intended to reveal something or to surrender it to someone she trusted. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat long into the night, the muslin scrap on the table before her. Her thoughts returned to the brooch, the letter, the key, the shed, the stolen papers, the glove, and now this new discovery. It was not a random scattering of clues, but a deliberate arrangement, each piece meant to obscure as much as it revealed. At last, she folded the cloth neatly and placed it with the other items she had guarded. Her eyes, calm and clear, lifted toward the window. Outside, the village lay silent, but she knew the silence was fragile. Someone in St. Mary Mead was watching closely, calculating their next move. Miss Marple's hands folded on her lap. She felt the end drawing nearer, the pattern beginning to take shape. Yet before the picture was complete, she feared there might be one more attempt, one more act of desperation. And as the church clock struck 2, she heard again the faint tread of footsteps in the lane, slower this time, as if the watcher were measuring his ground. The following morning broke pale and misty, the village wrapped in a damp stillness that seemed to hold its breath. Yet beneath that quiet, the atmosphere was taut. The attack on Constable Reeves at the quarry had unsettled even the most skeptical of villagers. Whispers carried through every doorway. A man had been seen, a figure of menace still at large, and Margaret Elwood's secret was far from buried. Miss Marple, sitting primly at her breakfast table, poured her tea with unhurried precision. She appeared calm, but her mind was anything but. The footsteps in the night, the muslin scrap, and the stolen papers, each piece added weight to the figure of C. She felt now that the culprit's mask was slipping. Fear makes people careless. And carelessness, in her experience, revealed more than confession. By mid-morning, she set out along the lane, her knitting basket hooked neatly on her arm. To any passer-by, she was nothing more than an elderly lady about her errands. But inside the basket, folded among her wool, was the parcel George had given her, the documents and jewels that Margaret had hidden. She had no intention of surrendering them yet, but she knew that word of their existence must already have reached the wrongers. Whoever C was, he would be desperate to recover them. And desperation, Miss Marple thought, could be gently coaxed into revealing itself. Her first visit was to Mrs. Bantry, whose sitting room was already alive with chatter. Several ladies had gathered, Mrs. Price Ridley among them, bristling with self-importance, and Mrs. Larkin, nervous but eager to share every scrap she'd overheard. Ah, Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry cried. "We were just saying, this dreadful business must soon be resolved. Reeves claims he's on the right track, though, between us, I'm not sure he knows where he's heading. But tell us, dear, what do you make of it all?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded demurely in her lap. "Well, my dear," she said, her tone deceptively mild, "I cannot help but think the matter is very nearly at its end. You see, Margaret left more behind than anyone realizes. Quite valuable things, I believe." There was a sudden silence. Mrs. Price Ridley's sharp eyes flicked toward her. Mrs. Larkin leaned forward, her breath caught. Miss Marple smiled gently, as though she had said nothing of importance. "What things?" Mrs. Price Ridley demanded. "Oh, I cannot be entirely sure," Miss Marple replied softly. "But papers, perhaps, and other tokens. She was entrusted, poor child, with keeping something very safe. And now, of course, those items must be returned to their rightful owner." Mrs. Larkin gasped. "But surely that would mean the person who gave them to her must come forward." "Quite so," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling faintly. "And that is what I expect will happen very soon." The conversation shifted quickly after that, but Miss Marple had seen what she needed. Mrs. Price Ridley, usually so quick to speak, pressed her lips together and looked away, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Mrs. Bantry, on the other hand, seemed genuinely intrigued, but not nervous. It was a small thing, but in Miss Marple's world, small things often mattered most. Leaving the gathering, she walked slowly toward the smithy. Peter Hollis was at work, the clang of metal ringing out in sharp rhythm. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed by suspicion cast upon him from every side. "Miss Marple," he said at once, setting down his hammer, "have they decided yet? Am I to be accused?" "Not by me, Peter," she said kindly. "But you must be patient. Truth takes time, and those who rush often stumble." He sighed heavily. "If only Margaret had trusted me. Whatever burden she carried, it killed her, and now it's killing me too." Miss Marple laid a hand lightly on his arm. "You may not see it, but she did trust you in her way. Only perhaps she thought to protect you from danger. And that, my dear boy, is something we must not forget." She left him calmer than she had found him, though still troubled. It was not Peter's guilt that weighed on her mind, but his innocence, and innocence was the true culprit sought to bury under suspicion. By late afternoon, Mrs. Marple made her way to the vicarage. Mr. Clement welcomed her again, and she asked politely if she might sit a while in the garden. From her chair beneath the yew tree, she could see the shed's padlock glinting faintly in the sun. Someone had come there again, she was certain, and they would come again. The trap she had set was not a net of ropes or chains, but of words. She had let slip enough to suggest that Margaret's hidden parcel still existed and that it would soon be restored to its owner. That whisper, she knew, would spread through the village faster than fire. Those who were innocent would shrug and gossip. Those who were guilty would tighten with unease. That evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple sat quietly by her window, her knitting in her lap. She watched as villagers passed along the lane, Mrs. Larkin in her shawl, the vicar hurrying home, and a boy whistling on his way to fetch milk. All ordinary, all familiar. Yet she knew that among them was the one who had signed that letter C, who had given Margaret the brooch, who had drawn her into a perilous game. Her thoughts were interrupted by another knock at her door. This time it was Mrs. Price Ridley again, her manner brisk but her eyes restless. "Miss Marple," she said sharply, "I must insist you tell me what these items are that Margaret supposedly left behind. It is most improper to keep such matters secret when the whole village is in danger." Miss Marple looked at her mildly. "Improper, perhaps, but secrecy has its uses. It often tempts those who are most anxious to recover what they have lost. And sometimes, my dear Mrs. Price Ridley, it is better to let temptation do its work." Mrs. Price Ridley flushed, muttered something about propriety, and left in a huff. But Miss Marple, watching her retreating figure, felt more certain than ever. The net was tightening. Fear was working on someone's nerves. She returned to her chair, her eyes calm, though her mind was alive with quiet certainty. Tomorrow, she thought, would bring the moment when the pieces must be laid bare. And as the church bell tolled 9, she whispered to herself, "It is nearly time to gather them all." It was Miss Marple herself who suggested the gathering. She did so in her usual mild way, over tea at Mrs. Bantry's, her voice never rising above its gentle cadence. "I think," she said, "that the matter has grown rather confused with so many stories and so much speculation. Perhaps it would be best if we all heard the same things at the same time. The vicarage would do nicely, don't you think?" Word spread swiftly, as it always did in St. Mary Mead. By the following evening, the vicarage drawing-room was filled. Colonel Melchett, who insisted on his presence for propriety's sake, stood near the mantel with an air of authority. Constable Reeves, still pale from his injuries, occupied a chair, grim and determined. Around them, the villagers gathered in tense anticipation: Mrs. Bantry, Mrs. Price Ridley, Mr. Pritchard, Mrs. Larkin, and a handful of others whose curiosity could not be restrained. Peter Hollis stood at the back, arms folded tightly, his face shadowed with strain. Miss Marple sat quietly near the fire, her knitting in her lap, as though she were merely a spectator, but those who knew her best recognized that her eyes, bright and shrewd, missed nothing. It was Colonel Melchett who began. "We are here," he declared, "to bring some order to this business. Poor Margaret Elwood has been cruelly murdered, and while Reeves has done his part, I dare say Miss Marple has observed more than most. I shall ask her to speak." All eyes turned to her. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, folded her hands, and looked around the room. "You see," she began gently, "there has been a thread running through all of this, if only one cared to follow it. The brooch, the key, the shed, the glove, and the parcel are all connected. Poor Margaret was entrusted with things that did not belong to her. She was frightened, quite naturally, but she kept her silence, and that silence cost her life." A murmur ran through the room. Reeves leaned forward, his eyes intent. Mrs. Bantry nodded gravely. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed, but her hands fidgeted in her lap. Miss Marple went on. "Now, one might easily think Peter Hollis guilty because of his quarrel with Margaret. But quarrels, my dear, are quite ordinary among young people. A quarrel is not a murder. What is more curious is the presence of gifts, the brooch, the gloves, and the letters. Tokens, if you will, from someone who signed themselves with the letter C." At this, several heads turned sharply. Mrs. Larkin gasped aloud. Colonel Melchett frowned. Reeves muttered, "The letter." Miss Marple continued as if she had not noticed the stir. Margaret believed herself bound by loyalty. She hid documents and jewels that were not hers. She wore the brooch at the garden party, not out of vanity, but as a signal that she had done as she was asked, that she had kept faith. Mrs. Price Ridley's lips parted as if to protest, but no sound came. Her face had paled. Miss Marple observed her, then looked back to the room. "Now," she said, "there are those who would tell us that a stranger was to blame." Tommy Briggs saw a tall man near the church, and Mrs. Larkin overheard Margaret say she could not hide something forever. But shadows play tricks, and overheard words may deceive. What is far more telling is who has been most insistent that suspicion remain fixed on poor Peter and on nameless outsiders. Her gaze lingered on Mrs. Price Ridley, just long enough for several others to notice. A ripple went through the room. The woman flushed crimson, then snapped, "I merely stated what anyone could see." "That boy had a temper. He is dangerous." "Dangerous in temper, perhaps," Miss Marple agreed softly, "but not in cunning. This crime required cunning and secrecy and the use of Margaret as an unwilling guardian. Someone placed those items in her care. Someone who then grew desperate when Reeves began to investigate, desperate enough to attack him near the quarry. Someone who knew about the shed and the key and the parcel. A hush fell over the room. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes bright with fascination. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, "are you suggesting you know who this C is?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear, I've suspected for some time. It was only necessary to see who would betray themselves when tempted with the thought of Margaret's hidden parcel. And indeed, some did betray themselves." Her eyes swept the room once more. Mrs. Price Ridley shifted in her chair, her hands tightening on her bag. Peter Hollis stood straighter, his jaw clenched, but his eyes steady. Reeves leaned forward, tense as though bracing for revelation, but Miss Marple did not speak the name. Not yet. She folded her hands once more, her voice mild. "The truth is quite plain, though not everyone sees it. Tomorrow, I would like us to meet again, all of us. By then, the final piece will be ready to show, and once it is shown, there will be no doubt at all." Colonel Melchett sputtered. "Another meeting?" "Surely, Miss Marple, if you know something, you ought to speak at once." She looked at him kindly. "Patience, Colonel. To reveal too soon is to allow denial, but to wait, then the guilty will betray themselves twice over." The gathering broke up uneasily. Villagers departed in twos and threes, whispering in the lane, their faces pale in the lantern light. Reeves muttered about keeping watch that night, and Colonel Melchett stalked away, grumbling. Miss Marple returned to her cottage in silence, her shawl drawn close. She knew the net had tightened. The guilty hand had twitched, betrayed by fear, by protest, by too much eagerness to blame another. One more step remained, and the pattern would be complete. As she closed her door and set her knitting aside, she murmured softly to herself, "Tomorrow, the picture will be quite clear." And outside, unseen, someone lingered in the shadows of the lane, listening, waiting, and desperate enough to risk one last move. The following evening, as Miss Marple had requested, the villagers once again gathered at the vicarage. The drawing-room was heavy with anticipation, every chair occupied, every whisper silenced the moment the door closed. The fire crackled faintly in the grate, but the air was thick with unease. Colonel Melchett stood stiffly by the mantel, his expression stern. Constable Reeves, pale but resolute, had stationed himself at the door. Peter Hollis remained at the back, his arms folded across his chest, while Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly, eyes bright with expectation. And at the center of it all, as calm as ever, sat Miss Marple, her knitting resting on her lap, her face serene. "My dear friends," she began, her voice gentle, "I told you last night that the truth was almost complete. Today, I believe it is clear enough for us all to see." A murmur passed through the room. Mrs. Price Ridley shifted in her chair, her mouth tight, her hands clutched firmly on her handbag. Miss Marple went on, her eyes sweeping across the faces before her. Poor Margaret Elwood was entrusted with things she did not understand. The brooch, the gloves, and the parcel of papers and jewels were tokens of something far greater than she knew. She believed she was helping, perhaps even protecting someone she cared for, but in truth she had been used to conceal matters too dangerous for their true owner to risk keeping. She lifted her knitting needles lightly, as though to mark a point. Margaret kept the secret, as she was told. But secrets of that nature are heavy, and they do not stay hidden for long. She confided to Mrs. Larkin, without naming names, that she could not keep it forever. She grew restless and uneasy, and at last the strain showed. And so the one who had burdened her with it all made certain her silence would be permanent. The room was very still. Only the sound of Reeves shifting uncomfortably broke the quiet. Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on Peter Hollis. Much suspicion has fallen upon Peter. He quarrelled with Margaret, yes. But quarrels are the prerogative of youth, and Peter's heart was never cruel. He had neither the cunning nor the cause to arrange such elaborate concealments. Nor was it some nameless stranger slipping through the village unseen. The truth, as I have often observed, lies far closer to home. She paused, her gaze moving deliberately to Mrs. Price Ridley. The woman flushed, her lips parting as though to protest, but Miss Marple's soft voice cut across her silence. The one behind all this, the one who signed himself or herself as C, is none other than you, Mrs. Price Ridley. A collective gasp filled the room. Mrs. Bantry clapped a hand to her mouth. Colonel Melchett sputtered. Nonsense! Preposterous! Reeves's eyes widened in shock. Mrs. Price Ridley rose halfway from her chair, her face scarlet. How dare you? I am a woman of standing. How dare you accuse me of such a monstrous crime? Miss Marple remained perfectly calm. I dare, Mrs. Price Ridley, because the pattern is plain. The brooch Margaret wore at the garden party once belonged to you. Several villagers remarked that they had seen it years ago, pinned upon their own dress at a fete in Much Benham. You claimed not to notice, but your silence betrayed you. When I mentioned Margaret had left behind valuable items, you grew pale and restless, pressing me to explain. That eagerness was not curiosity, it was fear. Fear that your own property, hidden in Margaret's care, would be discovered. Mrs. Price Ridley sank back into her chair, her hands trembling. Miss Marple continued gently, almost sorrowfully. You came into possession of those jewels and papers in questionable circumstances, perhaps an inheritance dispute, perhaps debts best not examined too closely. But you wished them hidden, kept away from curious eyes. Margaret, sweet and dutiful, was an easy choice. You gave her the brooch and the gloves, and perhaps even promised her some reward for her silence. But as time passed, she grew anxious. She thought of telling. And so, after the garden party, you followed her home, confronted her, and in that confrontation, you silenced her forever. There was another murmur, horrified now. Reeves straightened, his eyes fixed on Mrs. Price Ridley. Miss Marple sighed, her expression one of pity more than condemnation. When Reeves began to inquire into the shed, you struck him down near the quarry. You believed if you could recover the papers, all would be safe. But Margaret had already hidden the parcel elsewhere, under her own floorboard. It was that which George found and brought to me. And so, in the end, your efforts were wasted. Mrs. Price Ridley's lips moved soundlessly. At last, she whispered, I never meant she was stubborn, she threatened to tell. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. The silence that followed was heavy. Then Colonel Melchett, his face grim, gave a sharp nod to Reeves. The constable stepped forward, laying a hand on Mrs. Price Ridley's shoulder. She did not resist. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, her needles clicking softly. You see, she said gently, murder does not begin with weapons or blows. It begins with selfishness, with the desire to protect one's own reputation or comfort at any cost. Poor Margaret was no thief, no conspirator. She was simply a girl caught in the web of another's pride. The gathering broke up slowly, the villagers subdued, their whispers hushed. Peter Hollis, at last free from suspicion, stood for a long moment, then left with shoulders straighter than before. Mrs. Bantry lingered to clasp Miss Marple's hand, her eyes shining with both horror and admiration. When all had gone, and the vicarage lay quiet once more, Miss Marple stepped out into the cool night. The village was still, the hedgerows rustling faintly in the breeze. She walked home at her gentle pace, her mind calm though tinged with sadness. In her sitting room, she set her knitting aside and looked out into the darkness. The brooch, once glittering so brightly on Margaret's dress, had lost its lustre forever. It would be kept now in some evidence box, its beauty wasted. Miss Marple sighed softly. "So much vanity," she murmured. "So much pride. And all for a trinket." She closed her curtains, extinguished her lamp, and sat in the quiet, reflecting as always on human nature, its follies, its weaknesses, and its tragic capacity for harm. The village, outwardly peaceful, would settle again. Yet Miss Marple knew that beneath its calm surface, the same old truths would always lie waiting, ready to emerge in the shape of another mystery.